The smell of hot iron curled through the summer air, thick and metallic. It mixed with the stench of sweat and fear that clung to the crowd gathered in the ranch yard. A woman named Mara staggered forward, two rough hands clamped around her arms, her bare feet scraping splinters from the rough-hewn boards. Fresh blood smeared from the welts crisscrossing her back, a map of cruelty drawn just moments before. Near the corral, her three daughters clung together. Just three small figures, all tangled hair and tear-streaked faces, their tiny sobs completely swallowed by the buzz of the onlookers. The whispers were ugly, poison in the humid air, all saying the same thing. A woman who birthed only girls was cursed, useless. Standing tall and proud by the forge was the patriarch of the powerful Calder clan. His white shirt was spotless, a stark contrast to the filth of the yard, his face carved from cold stone. He lifted the branding iron high, its tip glowing a furious, spitting orange. It was the shape of the ranch's mark, the C-bar C, a symbol meant for the thick hide of cattle, not for a woman's flesh. "This is justice," the patriarch barked, his voice booming across the yard, silencing the whispers. "She shamed this family. She birthed weakness instead of heirs. Tonight, we burn the lesson into her skin for all to see." Mara's knees buckled. A raw, animal terror ripped through her chest, stealing her breath. But the men holding her were strong, their fingers bruising her arms as they yanked her upright, forcing her to face her punishment. "Mama!" The scream tore from the throat of little Arara, the youngest. She broke free from her older sisters, a tiny bolt of desperation darting forward. But she didn't get far. A guard snatched her by the hair, his face a mask of casual cruelty, and flung her back into the dirt like a rag doll. The crowd hissed. Some turned away, a flicker of shame in their eyes, but most leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle, their curiosity a vile thing. Mara's throat worked, but no words came out. Only a strangled sob that ripped through the humid night, a sound of a soul breaking. The patriarch sneered, his lip curling back from his teeth. He swung the iron toward her, a lazy arc of glowing death. The heat kissed her cheek, the air itself sizzling, so close it burned the tiny hairs on her skin. "Hold her steady," he growled to his men. The girls shrieked again, their cries piercing, a chorus of pure agony as the iron lowered, inch by agonizing inch toward Mara's shoulder. Then a voice cut through the mob. It was deep and steady, carrying across the yard like the rumble of distant thunder. "Let her go!" Every head snapped towards the gate. The crowd stilled, the tension so thick you could taste it. A lone figure stood framed in the moonlight, silhouetted against the dark hills. He was broad-shouldered, dust coating his long duster, a battered hat shadowing eyes that seemed to gleam like banked coals in the dark. It was Cole Rafferty, the reclusive widower rancher whose land bordered the Calders. A man known more for his silence than for speeches, a ghost who kept to his own burned-out piece of the valley. He stepped forward, his pace deliberate and slow. His boots thudded like hammers on the packed earth. Each footfall a declaration, commanding the space. The crowd, a moment ago a single hungry beast, parted before him as if pushed by a physical wind. The patriarch's lip curled into a deeper sneer. "This is family business, Rafferty. Ride on before you get caught in it." He spat the words out, dismissing the intruder. This was his land, his law. Cole didn't answer him. He didn't even look at him. His gaze swept over Mara, taking in the raw terror in her eyes, the bruises already flowering on her pale skin. He saw the three trembling girls, huddled like lambs waiting for the slaughter. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping along the bone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it was sharp enough to cut bone, and every single person in that yard heard it clear as a bell. "Those girls," he said, his eyes still on them, "are worth more than every son you've ever buried." A ripple of pure shock went through the crowd. Disbelief and a strange, thrilling fear tangled in the air. No one spoke to the Calder patriarch like that. No one. The patriarch's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He snarled, lifting the branding iron higher, its glow painting his face in demonic light. "They're nothing but mouths to feed. And she," he jabbed the iron toward Mara, "is the reason our name is in disgrace. Stand aside, Rafferty, or you'll be branded next." Cole just kept walking. He didn't rush. He didn't slow. He just closed the distance until he stood directly between Mara and the glowing iron, his back a broad, solid wall. He was a mountain that had just risen from the plains. He turned his head slightly, just enough for his next words to fall like stones into the dead silent yard. Then brand me, he said. Each syllable was deliberate, unflinching, a challenge thrown at the feet of a tyrant. Because from this moment on, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, yet somehow carrying even further, those girls are mine to raise, and no hand will ever touch them again. The crowd gasped as one. The daughter's sobs broke into stunned, hiccuping silence, and Mara's knees finally gave out, her body slumping against the men holding her, as the iron hovered in midair, its furious orange glow seeming to dim beneath the impossible weight of a vow that would set the whole damn valley ablaze. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The entire ranch yard was frozen, caught between the angry hiss of the forge and the ringing echo of Cole Rafferty's vow. The faces in the crowd were pale, ghostly things in the firelight, their eyes wide with a mix of terror and awe. Mara clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She couldn't comprehend what she had just heard. It was impossible. A dream born of pain. The three little girls, still huddled together near the corral, lifted their tear-stained faces, their eyes fixed on the tall, broad figure standing like a wall of flesh and bone between them and the monster who held the iron. Then the spell broke. The patriarch snarled, his face twisting, the veins in his neck bulging. "You dare!" His voice cracked like a whip. He didn't wait for an answer. He swung the glowing brand, not at Mara, but straight at Cole's face. "You think you can steal from me? Spit on my bloodline? Hold him!" he shrieked. His men, who had been frozen in shock, surged forward. Their boots pounded on the wooden boards, fists clenched, some yanking ropes from their belts, others drawing long, wicked-looking knives. The crowd roared back to life, half jeering, half shouting in panic as chaos erupted. Mara screamed as one of the brutes lunged for Cole, but the quiet widower moved with the shocking, brutal precision of a storm breaking a tree. His fist slammed into the man's jaw with a sickening crunch of bone, sending him sprawling into the dirt, teeth scattering like pebbles. The branding iron slashed through the air, its heat searing close enough to singe the fabric of Cole's duster. But he twisted, his hand shooting out, grabbing the patriarch's wrist with impossible speed. The smell of burning flesh filled the night. The patriarch shrieked, a high, thin sound of agony as the iron dropped from his scorched hand and fell into the dirt, hissing like a venomous snake. Chaos exploded. It was a whirlwind of violence. The patriarch staggered back, clutching his burned hand, his face white with pain and disbelief, while his men swarmed Cole like wolves on a wounded bull. Mara scrambled backward, her bare feet scraping splinters, pulling her daughters close as she watched the man, who had just saved them, fight like a force of nature. He wasn't just a rancher. He was something else entirely. With a sound like a whip crack, a length of heavy chain hissed free from Cole's belt. It wasn't a whip. It was thicker, made of worn, dark iron links, and it moved in his hand like a living thing. He spun, and the chain cracked across the faces and forearms of two men, the sound like splitting wood, followed by screams of pain. A knife flashed toward his ribs, but he moved inside the arc, catching the attacker's wrist. He twisted hard. The bones snapped with a loud pop, and he drove a heavy boot into the man's gut, sending him gasping into the dust. "Get him!" someone bellowed from the crowd, and three more men rushed him at once, trying to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. It was a fatal mistake. Cole swung the chain in a wide horizontal arc. It moved faster than the eye could follow. The heavy links caught one man across the throat, another on the jaw, snapping both with brutal, lethal finality. Blood sprayed across the boards, the hot iron scent mixing with the smoke from the forge until the whole yard reeked of violence and fear. The crowd faltered. The jeers died in their throats, turning to a collective, horrified silence. They were ranchers and farmers. They knew fights. But this was no ordinary fight. This was a reckoning. Cole wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling the Calder's power, one broken bone at a time. Mara's eldest daughter, barely 8 years old, whimpered, "Mama!" And Mara hugged her tighter, her body a shield, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Promises of safety, of a world that didn't have monsters like this in it. The patriarch staggered to his feet, his burned hand trembling, his eyes wild with a fury that bordered on madness. "You'll regret this, Rafferty," he spat, backing away toward the corral, using his uninjured men as a shield. "Those girls are mine by blood, and no drifter's vow can change that." Cole's chest heaved, blood now running from a shallow gash on his brow, but his voice was calm, a core of pure iron beneath the storm of his breathing. "Blood don't make a man worthy," he said, his eyes locked on the patriarch. "Choice does, and I choose them." The patriarch's snarl curdled into something darker, more dangerous, a promise of annihilation. He put two fingers to his lips and let out a whistle, sharp and piercing. From the darkness beyond the gates, a new sound arose, the thunder of hooves. More riders, dozens of them. They thundered through the gates, their rifles gleaming under the torchlight, their faces hard and grim. Mara's stomach dropped like a stone. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The real fight hadn't even started. Cole didn't hesitate. He spun, grabbing Mara's arm, his other hand scooping up the smallest girl, Aurora, in a single fluid motion. His voice was low and urgent in her ear. "Stay behind me. Run when I say." The riders fanned out, a closing circle of steel and horseflesh, surrounding them like wolves circling their prey. The forge hissed. The torches spat embers into the night, and the whole valley seemed to tremble on the edge of a slaughter as Cole planted his boots in the bloody dirt and readied himself to spill more Calder blood to keep his impossible vow. The riders fanned wide across the yard, a crescent of death, their rifles gleaming like serpents' fangs in the firelight. Their horses stamped and snorted, sensing the tension. The smell of blood thick in the air. The mob of onlookers, once a jeering force, now scrambled back, pressing themselves against the fences, their faces masks of terror. This had escalated beyond a simple branding. This was war. Mara clutched her two older daughters, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Terror was a living thing, burning through her bruises, making her breath a ragged, shallow rasp in the smoky air. But in front of her stood Cole Rafferty. He was a wall. His coat was torn, blood streaked his brow and ran from his lip, and the heavy iron chain was coiled loose in one hand, dripping with something dark. His chest rose and fell, slow and steady like the tide. His eyes were black coals fixed on the patriarch who sneered from the safety of his line of riders. "You brought this on yourself, Rafferty," the old man barked, his bandaged hand held protectively against his chest, trembling with a mixture of pain and pure rage. "You think you can shame me in front of my own blood and walk away breathing?" Cole's voice was low, so low it was almost a growl, but it carried through the night like the rumble of a distant storm, a promise of violence. "I've walked through worse fires than yours." The words struck something deep inside Mara. They weren't just a threat. They were a statement of fact. Her gaze flicked toward him, a question trembling on her lips. Who was this man? This silent neighbor she'd only ever seen from a distance? The patriarch let out a harsh, cracked laugh. "Worse fires? Don't you dare speak of fire to me, boy. I remember when you were nothing but a broke drifter, squatting on land you didn't deserve. You couldn't even save your own family." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads turned. Mara froze, confusion colliding with a sudden, sickening dread. She saw Cole's broad shoulders stiffen, his jaw tightening so hard she could see the muscles bunch under his skin. But he didn't look back at her. He didn't let the patriarch's poisoned words distract him. He took another step forward, the torchlight catching a network of old faded scars on the backs of his hands. Scars Mara hadn't noticed before. They were smooth and puckered, the kind left only by a terrible burn. "That night was your doing," Cole said, and his voice was raw now, laced with a grief so profound it was terrifying. "Your men. They rode out to burn my barn, to burn my stock, all because I refused to sell you my land. You said it was just business." He paused, his breath catching. And when he spoke again, the words were heavy with ghosts. My wife and my boy, they were inside that barn. They burned inside that barn because of you. Another gasp tore through the crowd, this one laced with horror. The patriarch's sneer faltered. For just a heartbeat, a flicker of guilt, or maybe fear, showed in his eyes before raw, unadulterated hate smothered it completely. They were weak, he spat, his tone brittle, dismissive. Collateral. Mara's throat closed on a silent cry as the terrible truth flooded her, a puzzle piece slamming into place, revealing a picture of unimaginable horror. The reclusive widower, the burned-out homestead, the silence. It wasn't just grief he carried, it was vengeance. The man who had stepped forward to claim her daughters wasn't just a quiet neighbor. He was a man carrying scars as deep as her own, burned into him by the very same fire. Cole's voice cracked, but his stance, his will, never wavered. I buried what was left of them with my own hands, he said, his voice shaking with the memory. And I swore on their graves that no one else would suffer the way I did. Not in this valley. Not while I still draw breath. His chain snapped tight in his grip, the metallic hiss a deadly promise curling through the tense night. Mara's tears blurred her vision, but she saw him clearly. For the first time since her nightmare began, she saw him not as a stranger, a savior, or a mystery. She saw him as a man bound to her and her girls by a shared history of grief and fire. He wasn't just fighting for them. He was fighting for the ghosts of his own family. The patriarch, seeing he'd lost the crowd, his power challenged and his dark secret exposed, made his final, desperate move. He raised his burned hand, pointing a trembling finger at Cole. Kill him, he commanded his riders, and bring me those girls. I'll raise them the proper Calder way. Mara screamed, a raw, primal sound, clutching her daughters tighter. But Cole's roar of pure, unleashed rage drowned her terror. He didn't wait for them to attack. He leapt forward, a blur of motion, his chain whipping through the air. It struck the barrel of the nearest rider's rifle, sending it spinning into the darkness. Gunfire erupted. The night exploded into a hell of noise and chaos. Horses screamed, their eyes wide with terror. And from somewhere out beyond the fence line, a new sound joined the fray. The long, eerie howl of a wolf. It was answered by another and another, their wild song braiding with the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifles. Mara dropped flat, pulling the girls down, shielding them with her own body as bullets hissed through the air over their heads. Cole moved like a storm unleashed. He was a whirlwind of chain and fury, cracking skulls, his fists shattering jaws. The riders, confident only moments before, faltered under his relentless, grief-fueled assault. But there were too many of them. Mara could see his strength starting to fade, his movements a fraction slower, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. His shirt was soaked in blood, some of it his, some of it not. In the swirling chaos, the patriarch saw his chance. He slipped away from his men, his face twisted with a sick triumph, and lunged toward Mara and the girls. Your daughters are mine, he hissed, his good hand reaching for the eldest child. Mara's scream ripped through the smoke and noise. Cole heard it. He spun, his head snapping around, and the look in his eyes was something beyond rage. It was the black, bottomless despair of a man who was about to lose everything all over again. With a sound that was less a yell and more like a man tearing open his own soul, he hurled the heavy chain with all his remaining strength. It flew through the air, a dark serpent wrapping around the patriarch's arm and yanking him off his feet, dragging him to the ground. No! Cole growled, his voice shaking the entire yard. They're mine now. Gunfire shredded the night, turning the smoke-filled yard into a strobing nightmare of muzzle flashes. Riders circled like vultures, their horses screaming, hooves tearing deep furrows in the blood-soaked dirt. Mara clutched her daughters, her back pressed hard against the rough wood of the corral fence, her heart pounding like a war drum. Her ears rang with the terrified cries of her girls and the constant, sickening metallic clash of Cole's chain cracking across another rider's skull. The patriarch lay sprawled in the dirt, his arm tangled in the very chain meant for branding cattle, his burned hand twitching weakly. His fury was spent, replaced by shock and pain. But his men fought on, their faces grim, driven by decades of blind loyalty and the promise of Calder power. "Cole!" Mara screamed. A rider had broken through, charging him from behind, his rifle raised like a club to crush Cole's skull. Cole spun, but he was too slow, his body already battered and bleeding. He was finished. But then, a gray blur erupted from the darkness. A massive wolf, bigger than any she had ever seen, slammed into the horse's flank. It moved with silent, impossible speed. It snarled, a low, guttural sound from the depths of the earth, and its teeth, long and white, sank deep into the horse's flesh. The animal screamed, a piercing shriek of pain and terror, and toppled sideways, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. Before the man could even think to rise, the wolf's jaws were on him, and his screams were cut brutally short. More howls rose from beyond the fences, not just one or two, but a chorus, a symphony of predators rolling over the hills like living thunder. Out of the darkness they poured, a whole pack of them, their fur silver under the moon, their eyes burning with a green, otherworldly fire. The crowd, which had been cowering by the fences, finally broke. They shrieked, stumbling over each other, men and women fleeing in a blind panic as the predators descended like spirits of vengeance. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Wolves were feared in this valley. Their howls were considered curses, omens of death. But tonight they were saviors. Cole didn't waste the opportunity. He staggered toward Mara, blood dripping from a deep cut over his eye, his breath coming in ragged, painful rasps. "We have to move. Now!" he grunted. He scooped up the youngest girl, Arara, with one arm while gripping Mara's elbow with the other, his touch surprisingly gentle as he pulled her toward the now unguarded gate. Behind them, the wolves were ripping through the Calder riders with terrifying efficiency. The middle daughter tripped, her small body collapsing in a sobbing heap. Mara, ignoring the fire in her own battered muscles, lifted her, holding her tight. "Mama, the wolves!" the girl cried, her small hands clutching her mother's neck. But Mara's voice, to her own surprise, held steady despite the wild fear in her heart. "They're not here for us," she whispered, a truth she felt deep in her bones. Cole's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking back to the carnage. "Not tonight," he said, his voice grim. One rider, half mad with terror, spurred his horse directly at them, desperate to break free from the circle of wolves. Cole shoved Mara and the girls behind him, his body a shield. His chain, which he'd recovered, snapped forward, a blur in the darkness. It wrapped around the rider's throat and yanked him from the saddle in a spray of blood and dust. "Go!" he barked, his voice raw, and they stumbled through the gate, their bare feet slapping against the cold, hard-packed ground of the road. Behind them, the ranch yard was a war zone. Wolves tore men from their saddles. Torches fell, rolling into dry hay near the forge, and the flames licked higher and higher. The screams of dying men rose and then, one by one, died. The patriarch's voice bellowed one last, desperate order before a massive silver wolf silenced him forever. Outside the ranch yard, the night was eerily clear, the stars sharp and cold in the vast dark sky. Mara's lungs burned as she ran, clutching two of her daughters, while the youngest sobbed quietly in Cole's strong arms. They didn't stop until they reached the shallow, rushing water of a creek bed, where they finally collapsed, gasping for air. Cole knelt in the water, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain, his blood mixing with the clear stream, turning it pink in the moonlight. Mara turned to him, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind a bone-deep ache and a flood of questions. Tears streamed down her face and her voice broke on a sob. "Why? Why would you risk your life for us?" He finally met her gaze, and, in the moonlight, she saw the full depth of his grief. His eyes were dark and hollow, haunted by ghosts. "Because once," he said, his voice cracking, "someone needed to stand between my family and the fire, and no one did." His words were a vow and a confession all at once. In the distance, the wolves howled again, their voices rolling over the dark hills, a sound that was no longer terrifying. It sounded like a hymn of judgment. Cole looked back toward the burning ranch yard, the orange glow painting the sky. His jaw was set like granite. "They'll come for us again," he said, his voice flat and certain. "The rest of them. And next time, they won't stop at branding." Mara held her daughters tighter, the cold of the creek forgotten. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tempered now by a strange, new fire in her chest. Cole wasn't just saving them from the Calders. He was declaring war on them, and he had just drafted her and her daughters into his army. The creek water ran cold around Mara's ankles, a chilling reminder of their flight. She huddled with her daughters beneath the gnarled, twisted roots of an old cottonwood tree, her arms aching from holding them so close. Their tiny bodies shivered against hers, their thin dresses soaked through, their tear-streaked faces pressed into the folds of her worn dress. Above them, the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon, a reluctant messenger painting the rising plume of black smoke from the Calder Ranch in long, ragged streaks against the sky. It looked like a fresh wound. Cole knelt at the edge of the bank, his back to them. His broad shoulders rose and fell with each ragged, painful breath. His shirt was torn nearly to shreds, revealing a canvas of old scars and fresh dark bruises. Blood still seeped from the gash on his side, but his posture was impossibly steady. He was a wall even when broken. Mara watched him through a haze of exhaustion and a fear so deep it felt like it had become part of her bones. Her heart pounded with the sheer crushing weight of what he had done. He had stood against the most powerful, most feared men in the valley, men no one even dared to look at sideways. He had claimed daughters that weren't his, a curse in the eyes of the world, and now he was bleeding for them in the cold dawn. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to ask 1,000 questions, but the words were tangled like thorns in her throat. Gratitude felt too small, too hollow for the sacrifice he had made. The girls whimpered softly in their sleep, and Mara kissed their damp hair, whispering soothing lies about safety and sunshine, while her own terror gnawed at her, a relentless beast. "It's all right, my loves. We're safe now." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Finally, Cole turned. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his battered hat, his eyes hollowed out by grief and exhaustion. Yet they still burned with a fierce, unwavering light. "They'll come again," he said, his voice low but unshakable. There was no doubt in it, only the certainty of a man who understood the nature of wolves and wicked men. Caldermen don't lose, not without hunting blood to get it back. Mara's breath caught. The fragile bubble of safety she'd tried to create for her daughters popped, leaving only the cold, hard reality. "We can't fight them all," she whispered, the words tasting of defeat. "We'll run. Head east. We can find a town where no one knows us, where the Calder name means nothing." Cole shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. His jaw tightened. "Running only works till you're cornered, and they will corner you. They have riders, rifles, and money. They own sheriffs in 3 counties. They'll track you to the ends of the earth. And next time," his voice dropped, becoming gravelly and grim, "they won't try to brand you. They'll just bury you." His gaze shifted from her to the sleeping girls, and for a single heartbeat, the hardness in his eyes softened. Then it was back, harder than before. "I won't let that happen." The injustice of it all, the sheer, relentless cruelty, finally broke through Mara's fear. Tears of rage and despair spilled down her cheeks. "But why us, Cole? You don't even know us. Why is this your fight?" His hands resting on his knees, fisted so tightly the knuckles went white. They trembled with a force that seemed to come from his very soul. "Because I've been you," he said, his voice raw. "I've been the one helpless, watching the fire. I buried my wife and my son with my own hands after Calder greed burned them alive in my own barn. I swore on their ashes that no other mother, no other child, would have to face that fire alone." His voice broke on the word alone, just for a breath. Then it steadied, cooling like forged iron. "Your girls are mine now, Mara. That's the God's honest truth. Not by blood, but by choice." The youngest Arara stirred, awakened by the intensity in his voice. She peeked out from behind Mara's shoulder, her big, frightened eyes fixing on Cole. Her small voice trembled, a single hopeful word in the gray dawn. "Papa?" The word, so simple, so innocent, cracked something deep inside Mara. A sob, hot and ragged, tore from her chest. It was a sound of grief for the father her girls had never truly had, and a terrifying, fragile hope for the one who had just walked out of the darkness for them. Cole moved, ignoring the pain that shot through his body. He knelt before them, his massive, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed a damp strand of hair from the child's face. "Yes, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "I'm here." The moment was fragile, a tiny flicker of warmth in a world of ash and blood. But for Mara, it was like a sunrise. It lit her heart with a new, unfamiliar fire. Not just the will to survive, but the will to fight. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not just a fighter or a ghost, but a man carrying his own crushing burden of scars. And he was ready, without question, to bear theirs too. From beyond the trees, a new sound shattered the quiet, the faint but growing pound of distant hoofbeats. Cole's head snapped up, his body instantly alert, his eyes narrowing. "They're regrouping, coming faster than I thought." He rose, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds, and grabbed the rifle he'd taken from a fallen Calder rider. "We need a safe place before nightfall. My homestead is 2 ridges west. It's burned out, but the cellar is stone. The walls are stone. They can't torch stone." Mara's fear, which had receded, clawed its way back up her throat. "Cole, you're wounded. You're barely standing. You'll die fighting them." He turned, his silhouette stark and powerful against the pale dawn sky. For a heartbeat, he seemed to be carved from the same ancient stone as his vow, a timeless guardian. "Then I die standing between them and you." As if on cue, the wolves howled again. Nearer this time, their eerie, wild hymn rolled over the hills, a sound that no longer felt like a threat, but like an answer. Mara hugged her daughters tighter, the sound raising gooseflesh on her arms. She understood then. The Calders weren't just chasing them. The land itself was holding its breath. The hills, the trees, the very rocks were waiting for a final, bloody reckoning, and they were at the heart of it. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, climbing toward its harsh midday peak when Cole finally slowed his pace. He guided Mara and the 3 girls through a narrow rocky ravine where the wind moaned like a ghost through the jagged stone formations. Mara's arms burned from carrying the youngest, while the older 2, their small faces smudged with dirt and fear, clung tightly to her skirts, their knuckles white. She could barely feel her feet anymore, the soles raw and bleeding, but she didn't dare complain. She didn't dare make a sound. Every step away from the Calder ranch was a fragile thread of hope, and she couldn't risk it snapping. Cole limped ahead of them, a wounded giant. His body swayed with exhaustion, but it was the swaying of an oak in a storm, battered but unbroken. His broad shoulders were a shield against the wilderness and the unseen enemy hunting them. The makeshift bandage he'd tied around his ribs was completely soaked through with dark crimson blood. Sweat gleamed on his temples, carving clean paths through the grime on his skin. But his grip on the stolen rifle never faltered. It was an extension of his arm, of his will. Mara's heart twisted every time she looked at him. This man, bleeding and hollowed out by a grief she was only just beginning to understand, was walking like a storm that simply refused to die. All for them, strangers. When they finally crested the final, rocky rise, she stumbled to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. Before them lay the ruins of a homestead. A tall stone chimney rose like a solitary gravestone from a field of ash and charcoal. Blackened timbers jutted out like the broken bones of some great beast. A collapsed barn sagged under the weight of years of neglect and sorrow. The earth itself seemed scarred, scorched, a silent, weeping testament to the fire that had stolen Cole's past and forged his future. The girls, sensing the oppressive sadness of the place, clung even tighter to Mara's skirts, their eyes wide and solemn. Cole stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the wreckage of his life. His jaw was so tight it looked like it might crack. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, a ghost haunting the graveyard of his own heart, torn between the love he had lost and the new fragile responsibility he had just claimed. Mara found her voice, stepping closer to him, her hand hovering just above his arm before she dared to touch him lightly. Cole, she said softly, we don't have to stay here. We can find another place. Keep moving. He shook his head, the motion small but absolute. His voice was low, but steady as the stones at his feet. This land is all I have left of them, and its stones are strong. The calders can burn wood, but they can't burn rock. He led them past the skeletal remains of his home to a half-hidden cellar door near the base of the stone chimney. Its thick wooden planks were charred and blackened, but they were intact. With a grunt of effort that sent a fresh wave of pain across his face, he pried it open, revealing a dark, cool hollow. The cellar was small, lined with thick, expertly fitted stone, a fortress beneath the ash. You'll be safe down here, he said, his voice echoing in the small space, while I hold them off. Mara's stomach knotted into a ball of ice. Hold them off? Cole, you can't fight them alone. There will be more of them this time. Many more. His dark eyes met hers and they were completely, terrifyingly unflinching. I won't be alone. As if summoned by his words from somewhere beyond the burned-out hills, a low, mournful howl rolled through the hot afternoon air. It was answered by another, and then another, until the hair on Mara's arms stood on end. The girls gasped, their small faces turning to the sky, their eyes searching for the source of the sound. Cole's gaze didn't waver from hers. The wolves, he said, a statement of fact, not a guess. They've been trailing us since the creek. They're not tame, Mara. Don't ever think that. But they hate Calder blood as much as I do. Last night they were vengeance. Tonight they'll be an army. Mara stared at him, her mind struggling to accept what he was saying. She didn't know if he was mad from his wounds or blessed by some dark, wild magic she couldn't comprehend. Why? She whispered. Why would they fight for you? For the first time, the corner of his lips curved in a grim, fleeting smile. It was a sad, terrible thing to see. Some scars run deeper than blood, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The Calders have been poisoning this valley for generations, taking and breaking whatever they want. This land, it remembers its own. While she settled the girls in the cellar, making them as comfortable as she could with old grain sacks, Cole worked with a relentless, feverish precision. He cleared lines of fire from the cellar door. He stacked fallen stones from the chimney to create cover. He used his knowledge of the land to set subtle, deadly traps along the narrow paths leading up to the ruined homestead. Mara's hands shook as she fetched water from the small spring behind the ruins, helping where she could, her fear a hot, constant presence. But beneath the fear, a strange, fierce strength was growing. This place, once a tomb of ash and sorrow, was breathing again. It was becoming a fortress, because Cole Rafferty willed it so. As dusk began to bleed across the horizon, smudging the pale blue sky with strokes of orange and purple, the sound they had been dreading reached their ears, the distant, unmistakable thunder of hoofbeats. Mara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She instinctively clutched her daughters. Cole, who had been sighting down his rifle, straightened slowly, the weapon cradled in his arms like it was an extension of his very soul. And the wolves answered. Their chorus of howls was closer this time, much closer, their voices weaving through the twilight like an ancient, bloodthirsty hymn. Cole's silhouette was stark and black against the dying light. His voice was a vow carved from the valley's own stone. They're coming, he said, and this time, we finish it. Mara herded her daughters down into the cellar, pulling the heavy door almost closed. Her last sight of him was an image that would be burned into her heart forever. A lone, broken man standing in the ashes of his past, ready to face an entire storm with only blood, stone, and a pack of wild wolves for allies. Night fell like a blade, sharp and sudden. The last streaks of crimson bled from the sky as a deep, starless darkness swallowed the hills. Mara crouched inside the stone cellar, clutching her daughters against her. They whimpered softly, their breath warm and fast against her neck, their small bodies trembling. Outside the burned homestead, the world went unnervingly silent. The only sound was the low, steady growl of the wolves, hidden somewhere in the tree line, a constant, menacing vibration that she could feel in her bones. Their eerie chorus rose and fell like the slow, deep breath of the earth itself, a clear warning to any who dared approach. Cole knelt just beyond the cellar door, a dark shape against the even darker night. His rifle was balanced on a pile of stones, his chain coiled within easy reach. The flickering light of a single small lantern he'd lit painted his scarred face with dancing shadows, making his expression look like it was carved from granite. Mara wanted to call out, to beg him to come inside and hide with them, to abandon this insane suicidal stand. But she knew better. The words died in her throat. He was the wall between her children and the ruin of the world, and walls don't run. The first sound came as a whisper on the wind, the faint creak of saddle leather, the slow, cautious crunch of many hooves in the dry grass. Then a rider's voice, low and mocking, drifted through the dark. "Rafferty, you think you can steal Calder blood and hole up like a rat in your own grave? Come on out. Maybe we'll only take the woman's skin this time." Mara's stomach turned to ice. She pulled her daughters even closer, their faces buried against her chest. Cole's breath was slow, controlled, audible even from the cellar. "Stay quiet," he whispered to them, his voice coming through the small cracks in the cellar door. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, don't come out." The riders crept closer, their dark shapes taking form against the dim glow of their torches. Mara peered through a crack, her heart hammering. There were 10 of them, at least, all armed with rifles. Their leader was a towering brute with a black bandana masking the lower half of his face. She recognized him. He was the patriarch's second in command, a man known to be even meaner, hungrier for violence, and now undoubtedly eager to avenge his fallen master. Cole's fingers tightened on the stock of his rifle. The world held its breath. Then the wolves struck. They burst from the darkness in a silent, terrifying wave of gray fur and green fire eyes. Their snarls, when they finally came, tore the night wide open. Horses screamed, rearing up, their eyes white with panic, throwing riders who fell into a maelstrom of snapping jaws. The men shouted, firing their rifles wildly, their carefully laid plans dissolving into pure chaos. Their torches spun through the air, casting frantic, distorted shadows. Cole rose in the exact same instant, a phantom rising from the stones. His rifle cracked once, twice. The sound was sharp and final. 2 men dropped from their saddles before they could even aim. He moved with a deadly, fluid grace, each shot precise and economical. His chain hissed through the dark, a black whip that lashed out and ripped a rifle from a panicked rider's hand. Mara's heart pounded so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She watched, mesmerized, through the crack in the cellar door. The sight was both terrifying and holy. Wolves and man, fighting as one. Wild nature and human grief, bound together in a brutal, bloody ballet against cruelty. The brute leader, showing more courage than the others, roared in fury. He swung his rifle like a club, beating back a wolf that lunged for his throat, then bellowed an order to his terrified men. "Forget him! Torch the cellar! Smoke them out like the rats they are!" Mara's breath caught, raw terror flooding her veins. Smoke them out. Burn them alive. She clutched her girls tighter, her mind screaming, whispering promises of safety that she knew, with sickening certainty, she could not keep. Cole heard it too, and the sound that ripped from his throat was not human. It was a roar of pure primal fury. "No!" He leapt from his cover, abandoning his fortified position, charging headlong into their midst. His chain was a blur, snapping like lightning. The wolves seemed to sense the shift in him, his desperation, his rage. They surged with him, a single unified force, tearing and rending, their howls of bloodlust drowning out the screams of dying men. Fire began to spread where torches had dropped among the dry, rotted timbers of the old barn. The flames licked higher, painting the chaotic scene in a flickering, hellish light. But Cole's fury was a storm no blaze could ever match. One by one, the riders fell, some to the snapping jaws of the wolves, others to Cole's rifle and chain, until only the brute leader remained. He stood his ground, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He lunged at Cole with a long hunting knife, slashing wildly. The blade cut a deep gash along Cole's side. Cole grunted in pain, but he didn't falter. He didn't even seem to notice. His chain lashed out, wrapping around the man's throat, and he yanked, pulling the brute to his knees. "You want blood?" Cole hissed, his face inches from the man's, his voice a low, gravelly promise of death. "Take mine first." With a single savage pull, he ended the fight. Silence slammed down on the homestead, a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged panting of the wolves and the terrified whimpers of the riderless horses. Mara burst from the cellar, tears of relief and terror streaming down her face as Cole staggered toward her. His body was battered, bleeding from a dozen new wounds, but his eyes still burned with that same indomitable fire. "It's not over," he rasped, his legs finally giving out as he collapsed into her arms. The wolves, their grim work done, howled in victory beneath the rising moon. The dawn sky glowed a pale, sickly gray as smoke curled upward from the burned timbers of the old homestead. The blackened skeleton of Cole's former life was a silent, grim witness to the night's slaughter. Mara knelt beside him where he lay propped against the cold stone wall of the cellar. His shirt was completely soaked with blood, a dark, ugly stain that seemed to be spreading. His breathing was ragged, shallow, but steady. For now, her hands trembled as she pressed a strip of cloth, torn from her own dress and soaked in clean water from the spring, to the deep gash in his side. She fought against the terror that clawed at her throat, the fear that he would die right here, in the ashes of his past, leaving them alone once more. Around them, the wolves paced in restless circles, their green fire eyes never leaving the tree line, as if they knew this wasn't the end. They were sentinels, guardians born of the wild land itself. The girls sat huddled together a few feet away, their eyes wide and full of a terrible, adult knowledge. They were silent now, their fear slowly, almost imperceptibly, giving way to something harder, something fiercer. They were the daughters of the storm. Cole's voice came, low and gravelly, startling her. "They'll come again, bigger this time, meaner. Calder blood doesn't know how to quit. It only knows how to take." Mara's jaw tightened, a surge of pure, hot anger cutting through her fear like a knife. He was right. Running was a death sentence. Hiding was a death sentence. "We can't just keep waiting for them to find us, Cole," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "They'll hunt us until there's nowhere left to hide." His dark eyes, clouded with pain, lifted to meet hers. They were weary, so weary, but they still burned with that stubborn fire. "Then we don't run," he rasped. He shifted, a sharp grimace of pain tightening his features. "We make a stand. But I can't fight them alone this time. Not all of them." Mara froze, the wet cloth still in her hand. The weight of his words sank into her, heavy as stone. All her life she had been beaten down, told she was worthless, a curse for birthing daughters instead of sons. She had been forced into silence while men decided her fate, her value, her very right to exist. Her gaze drifted to her girls. They were bruised, barefoot, their dresses torn, yet they were watching her, their small faces filled with a fragile, desperate hope. Something broke inside her then. Not her spirit, but the cage around it. It cracked open like a shell, revealing the hot, glowing ember that had been hidden deep inside for years. "You won't fight alone," she whispered, the words trembling, but sure. "Not anymore." Cole studied her face, searching her eyes. A faint, bloodied smile twitched at the corner of his lips. "Good," he breathed, a sigh of relief. "'Cause we'll need more than wolves to win this war." Mara frowned, her new resolve already being tested. "The town won't help us. They're all too scared of the Calders. They've stood by and watched for years." Cole's eyes darkened, his voice turning hard as the stones around them. "Then we give them a reason to stop being scared." He gestured weakly with his head toward the distant hills to the south. "There's a church, a meeting house, 5 miles that way. If you ride now, you can get there before the main Calder force does. Tell them what happened. Tell them everything. Show them your scars, Mara. Show them the truth." Mara's breath caught, fear flooding her veins again. The townsfolk. They'd called her cursed for years. They'd whispered behind her back. They'd turned away when she was beaten. They'll turn on us, she said, the old fear tasting bitter in her mouth. They'll hand us over. Not cursed, Cole cut in, his tone as sharp as a blade. Chosen. You survived them, Mara. You stood up when no one else would. That makes you stronger than all of them combined. Her eldest daughter, Ara, crept closer, her small, dirt-smudged hand finding Mara's. Mama, she whispered, her voice small but firm. We'll help you. We're not scared. Mara's throat tightened. She looked into her daughter's tear-streaked face. The girl had seen too much pain, too much horror for her young years. Yet her eyes held the same defiant fire she now felt stirring inside herself. The Calders had wanted to break them. Instead, they had forged them into weapons. Mara nodded slowly, a decision solidifying in her heart. All right, we'll go. We'll bring them back here to fight with you. Cole's hand closed around hers, his grip surprisingly strong, rough and warm. I'll hold this ground with the wolves till you return. As if the devil himself had heard their plan, the sound of distant hoofbeats shattered the fragile morning calm. More riders, coming from the east. Mara's heart lurched, adrenaline surging through her. She scrambled to her feet, gathering the girls, her fingers shaking as she helped them onto the back of a tired-looking mule they'd found wandering free after the fight. The youngest whimpered, clutching a small, crudely carved wooden wolf Cole had given her while he'd been working on his defenses. Cole forced himself upright, leaning heavily on his rifle, his face pale and slick with sweat. Ride fast, he commanded. Don't look back. And Mara, she turned, her breath caught in her throat, one hand on the mule's bridle. His voice was hoarse, ragged, but steady as a rock. When they doubt you, when they mock you, let them see the one thing the Calders feared most. Mara's chin lifted, a queen in rags, her eyes blazing. My daughters, she said, her voice ringing with newfound fire. And the truth. As she cracked the makeshift reins against the mule's flank, the wolves howled, a sound of both farewell and promise. The mule jolted forward, carrying Mara and her children toward a town that would either rise up beside her or betray them all to the fire. The old church bell tolled, a hollow, slow sound that seemed to count down the final moments of the valley's life. Mara drove the tired mule and the creaking cart they'd found abandoned into the town square, and the morning light spilled across faces that turned toward her in collective shock. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the restless hooves of the old mule, who was now pulling not just her daughters, but a large wooden crate filled with the rifles and ammunition taken from the dead Calder men. Her girls clung together, their faces pale and wide-eyed, but their small chins were held high. The townsfolk crowded closer, their whispers a mix of curses and prayers, their gazes slicing at Mara like knives. For years they had called her cursed. For years they had turned their backs when the Calders beat her, their silence a wall as thick and impenetrable as the one she'd been forced to build around her heart. But today she rode not with chains, but with fire. She stood tall on the cart, her shoulders squared, her back straight despite the burning welts. Her voice was sharp enough to split the morning air, and it cracked with a righteous fury that commanded their attention. Look, she cried, her voice ringing off the false fronts of the buildings. Look at what the Calders have done! She yanked down the collar of her torn dress, revealing the fresh, ugly purple and yellow bruises on her throat and shoulders. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman fainted. They beat me for the crime of giving life to girls, she shouted, her voice rising with every word. They tried to burn me alive with a branding iron, to mark me as less than their cattle. And they will do the same to any of you who dare stand in their way. They will take your land, your children, your lives, and you will let them, because you are afraid. The murmurs swelled, the shame on their faces warring with their fear. A preacher, a man with gray, trembling hair and watery eyes, stepped forward from the crowd. Mara, he said softly, his voice full of pity that felt like an insult. Your pain is real. We all know it. But the Calders own half this valley. To speak against them is death. Mara's eyes burned. Then let death come, she roared, and the force of it made the preacher take a step back. I will not hide my daughters in the shadows any longer. My scars are the proof of their cruelty. And these girls, she turned, lifting Ara's small hand high for all to see. Her daughter's tear-streaked face, a portrait of innocence wronged. These girls are the future they fear most. The crowd shuddered, their shame and awe mingling into something new, something dangerous, something like courage. Then the thunder of hoofbeats split the moment. Calder riders burst into the square from two directions, a pincer movement of death. Their rifles gleamed, their horses were frothing, and behind them, a rider carried a black banner with the C-bar C, a flag of hate unfurling in the morning sun. At their head rode the brute leader, the one who had commanded the attack on Cole's homestead, the one who had escaped. His scarred face was twisted with a triumphant, murderous rage. "Seize the woman!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the square. "And burn this town to the ground if they try to shelter her." Panic surged through the townsfolk. Some screamed and scattered, running for their homes. Others stood frozen in place, paralyzed by the terror that had ruled their lives for so long. Mara's heart pounded against her ribs, a wild drum of war. But she did not flinch. She did not run. She jumped from the cart, taking one of the rifles from the crate, and placed herself between the riders and her daughters. "If you want them," she shouted, her voice clear and steady, "you'll have to ride over me first." The brute sneered, a truly ugly sight. He spurred his horse forward, raising his own rifle to take aim. For a single terrible heartbeat, it seemed the town would let her fall alone, sacrificing her to save themselves. Then a single rifle cracked from the crowd. The brute's horse screamed and collapsed, shot in the chest. The blacksmith, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who had lost his own wife to Calder greed years before, stepped from the crowd, smoke curling from the long barrel of his hunting rifle. "No more," he said, his voice a low, iron growl. And that was all it took. A roar erupted from the crowd as the townsfolk surged forward. Pitchforks and hunting rifles and axes that had been hidden away were suddenly raised high. The chains of fear that had bound them for a generation shattered in a single, glorious instant. The square became a battlefield. Riders clashed with farmers. Gunfire and screams and the clang of steel filled the air. Mara fought like a woman reborn, swinging a fallen rifle like a club, her daughters shielded behind the overturned cart. Just when it seemed the townsfolk, brave but outmatched, would break under the charge of the trained riders, a new sound split the chaos, a long, chilling howl. Wolves poured into the square like living shadows, their green eyes blazing with an unholy light. Horses screamed, scattering in blind panic as the predators ripped through the Calder ranks, their jaws snapping, their fury absolute. The tide of the battle turned in an instant, and then, through the smoke and confusion, he appeared. Cole. Bloodied, staggering, but unbroken. He must have followed her. He fired his rifle with deadly, unerring precision, and his chain lashed out, wrapping a rider's throat and yanking him from the saddle. The brute leader, his horse gone, his men being torn apart by wolves and farmers, locked eyes with Cole across the square. Rage and fear collided in his eyes. He let out a wordless roar of pure hatred and charged through the melee, a long blade raised high. Cole met him head-on, his body a missile of pure vengeance. The two men crashed together in the center of the square. Two forces of nature, two symbols of the valley's warring soul, colliding as the battle for freedom raged around them. The town square was a storm of smoke and screams. Torches, knocked from their sconces, sputtered in the dirt as wolves tore through the last of the Calder riders, their guttural snarls mingling with the battle cries of townsfolk who had finally cast off their chains of fear. Mara clutched her daughters behind the overturned cart, her arms aching but steady, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched Cole stagger into the center of the chaos. His face was a mask of blood and fury. His shirt soaked a dark crimson, yet his eyes burned with a fire that refused to be extinguished. Across from him, the brute leader, the last of the patriarch's loyal monsters, kicked away the body of a wolf he'd just killed, his chest heaving. His long blade gleamed in the gray dawn light. "You should have stayed buried in your ashes, Rafferty," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "This valley belongs to Calder blood. Always has, always will." Cole's jaw clenched. His chain dangled loose in one hand, his rifle discarded somewhere behind him. "Then let it drink yours," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying vow that carried across the square. They circled each other. The battle around them seemed to fade away. Wolves and men alike paused, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which man would walk away. The brute lunged first, a clumsy, rage-fueled slash. Cole dodged under the blade, the chain in his hands snapping out like a striking snake. It wrapped around the brute's wrist and Cole yanked, pulling the bigger man off balance. The brute snarled, ripping his arm free, the chain leaving a bloody furrow in his skin. He slashed back, the tip of the blade grazing Cole's ribs. Cole grunted, his body swaying, but he struck back, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sound like a gunshot. Mara screamed his name, her daughters clutching her skirts, but Cole didn't falter. He couldn't. The brute, stunned but not down, tackled him, using his weight to drive Cole to the ground. The two men crashed into the dirt, rolling amid the blood and dust, grunting, snarling, two animals fighting for dominance. With a surge of adrenaline, Cole wrenched the blade from the brute's hand and flung it away into the dust. Then, with his last ounce of strength, he wrapped the heavy iron chain around the man's thick throat. "For my wife," he snarled, pulling the chain tight, his muscles straining. "For my boy." The brute clawed at the iron links, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging with terror. Cole's entire body trembled with the effort, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. But he didn't release his grip. He held on until the last shudder left his enemy's body. Silence slammed down, a profound, absolute silence, broken only by a single wolf's low, mournful howl. Cole collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, the chain slipping from his numb fingers. Mara rushed to him, tears of relief streaming down her face, her daughters following close behind her like small, brave shadows. She knelt in the bloody dirt and cradled his head in her lap, sobbing his name over and over. "You came back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought," he rasped, forcing a weak, painful smile. "I swore. I swore to stand between you and the fire." Behind them, the townsfolk were finishing the job, driving the last of the Calder men into the dirt or into the hills. The blacksmith raised his rifle high, his voice booming with a freedom he hadn't known in years. "The Calders are finished. This valley is ours again." A cheer rose up, ragged and fierce at first, then growing stronger, rolling through the square like a cleansing wind. The wolves lifted their heads, their wild howls joining the sound of the rising dawn, as if to seal the victory in blood and song. Mara stood, pulling her daughters into her arms, then turned to face the gathered townsfolk. Her voice was clear, unwavering, the voice of a leader forged in fire. "These girls are not curses," she cried, lifting Ara high so all could see. "They are our future, and from this day forward, no one in this valley will ever be beaten or branded for bringing life into this world again." The crowd roared their agreement, tears shining on the hardened faces of farmers and blacksmiths and merchants. A new era had begun. Cole staggered upright beside her, bloodied but proud. He placed a trembling hand on Mara's shoulder, his other resting gently on the head of the youngest child, who looked up at him with eyes full of trust. "They are mine now," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, a promise carved into the very stone of the valley. "By choice, not by blood, and anyone who ever dares to touch them will answer to me." As the sun finally broke free of the horizon, its golden light turned the valley into a place of promise, washing away the darkness and the blood of the long night. Mara's scars, visible on her neck and back, gleamed like medals of honor, and for the first time in years her daughters laughed, their small, joyous sounds a promise of healing. The wolves, their work done, melted back into the forest, their howls fading into the hills, leaving behind a silence that was filled not with fear, but with hope. Together, Mara and Cole, a broken man and a shattered woman, walked forward through the ash and blood. They were a family forged not by birthright, but by fire, and choice, and defiance. They were ready to rebuild their world, a world that would never again bow to the cruelty of men like the Calders. This story is a reminder that the strongest families are the ones we choose, and the greatest courage is found when we stand up for those who can't stand for themselves. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of fighting back, don't forget to like and subscribe.